it was either him or another candidate, doesn't really matter, that they described as bolshy and outspoken. Bolshy meaning Bolshevik-like. It's like, well, you know, he's appropriately bolshy. It's like, it's no different than saying, well, he's appropriately Nazi-like. Like, what the hell is that? I mean, there were 50 million people that were killed in the Soviet Union by the Bolsheviks, and maybe twice that many in China. And that says nothing about Cambodia and all the other places there were radical left bloodbaths. You think it's cute to call someone Bolshe? Jesus, it's appalling. It's appalling. It's not some fashionable thing that you do. It's a participation in some of the deepest intellectual morasses of evil that human beings have ever managed to create. And yet it's fashionable. It shows you what the universities are worth.
After the horrors of the 20th century communism and the failure of socialist policies, you would like to think that Marxist ideas wouldn't be advocated for or at least largely condemned, much like Nazism, despite the fact that communism killed tens of millions more than Nazism did. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and Marxism has become popular on college campuses along with social policies as Bernie Sanders rose into millennial stardom in the 2016 Democratic primary. This has had pretty bad results, as there are videos like the one with the student from Yale screaming at her professor, and more arrive on the daily as campusreform.com reports and shares the videos given to them from universities from across the countries. This continues as free speech protests, not only in the United States, but ones in Canada, are being labeled as bigoted events.
Walk away. He doesn't deserve to be listened to. He doesn't deserve to be listened to.
Be quiet! For all Stillman students. You understand that? As your position as master, it is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students that live in Stillman. You have not done that. By sending out that email, that goes against your position as master. Do you understand that? Then
no, I don't agree with that.
You.
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down! If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down! It is not about creating an intellectual space! It is not! Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here!
The best example of this would be Professor Jordan Peterson from the University of Toronto, who has stirred the pot like no one else has done in quite a while. Jordan Peterson made the headlines when he was a part of a protest against a motion that was being pushed in Canada that he considered anti-free speech, and caused many of his detractors to claim he's transphobic and bigoted overall. He has recorded his lectures and speaks strongly against Marxism and blames the education system on why Marxism and communism isn't viewed as negatively alike as Nazism and fascism is. His podcasts with Joe Rogan have been very popular and very insightful to how these things go into action.
And when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good. And that's what happened to all the old guard who ran the damn revolution. Stalin rounded them all up and shot them, along with their families and millions of other people. So even if you do happen to be that avatar of moral purity that you claim implicitly, the probability that you'd get to act out your goodness in relationship to those possessed by your ideology is zero. One of the things that's quite interesting about the Gulag camps, and this is something that's very relevant to understanding of modern Russia, is that so ordinary criminals were put into the camps, and so were political prisoners. But the ordinary criminals, and so those would be rapists and murderers, let's say, as well as thieves who were engaged in theft as an occupation. Those were regarded by the Soviets as socially friendly elements. And the reason for that was that they assumed that the reason that these people had turned to crime was because of the oppressive nature of the previous czarist/capitalist system, and that the only reason that these criminals existed was because they had been oppressed. They were oppressed victims of that system. And so one of the convenient consequences of that absolutely insane doctrine was that the Soviets put the ordinary criminals in charge of the camps. And these were very, very seriously bad people. And so you can imagine the way that they treated the political prisoners, who were regarded as socially hostile elements, sometimes because of their own hypothetically traitorous acts, but more often merely as a consequence of their racial or ethnic identity, or the fact that they were related by birth to, say, people who had been successful under the previous system, so who had any association with nobility or any association with what were known as the kulaks, who were the only successful class of former peasants in the Soviet Union, because they were regarded as privileged. You may have heard that word more recently. They were regarded as privileged and therefore as enemies of the state, and it didn't matter if it was your father or your grandfather or your great-grandfather who happened to be privileged, but the mere fact that you were a member of that group was sufficient reason to put you into a camp. And we're talking hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people who underwent that fate. And so the idea in the Soviet Union was, just because you were the member of a class, even as a consequence of your familial association, you were immediately sufficiently guilty to be put into a camp and punished. And the terms for the camps were often 10 years, 15 years long. And if you were very fortunate, you got to have 2 or 3 of those. So the Soviets really implemented and perfected the idea of class and ethnicity-based guilt. And it's a very bad road to walk down.